Sophia Wells stood in the heart of the bustling New York City train station, her heart sinking with each passing second. The loud announcements, the hurried footsteps, the clattering of suitcase wheels against the floor, none of it could drown out the heavy silence between her and James Walker. They had come here together, hoping to board the same train that would carry them to their future. Instead, here they stood, at a crossroads neither of them had ever imagined. James, the man she had loved for years, the man she had trusted with her heart, had just shattered everything in a few cold words. He had never been one for grand speeches, but the finality in his voice cut through her like a knife. "Sophia," he began, his tone firm but lacking the warmth she had once adored, "I've made up my mind. It's over. I'm leaving." Her breath caught in her throat. "What do you mean? What are you saying, James? We have a life here. You and me, together." He looked at her, but there was no softness in his eyes anymore, no trace of the man who had once promised her forever. His gaze was distant, almost as if he was speaking to someone else. "I can't keep living like this. My family's expectations, the future they want me to have, it's too much. I've worked my whole life to get where I am, Sophia. My career, my future, they're everything. This," he gestured vaguely at the two of them, "at the life they had tried to build, isn't enough. It's not going to work." The words hit her like a thunderclap. She had expected many things, but not this. Not the man she had supported, the man she had stood beside through everything, abandoning her in such an impersonal, cold way. "But we have a child, James," she whispered, her voice trembling. "We built a life together. You promised." "I didn't promise you anything," he interrupted, his voice sharpening. "You and the child, you're just distractions. I have to think about my future, my family's future." His gaze shifted, almost impatient, as if her pain was an inconvenience he could not bear to entertain. "I'm sorry, but I've made my decision. I can't be what you need. I'm walking away." Sophia felt her world crash down around her. She stood there, unable to speak, her chest heavy with a pain she had never known. She wanted to scream, to beg him to stay, to remind him of the love they had shared, of the promises he had made. But her words were lost, swallowed by the noise of the station, by the finality in his voice. "I have to go," James said simply, turning away from her without another glance. "Goodbye, Sophia." The sound of his footsteps fading into the distance was the only thing that remained. The world felt unreal, as if it had shifted, and she was now standing in a place she didn't recognize. The last glimpse of James was of his back, retreating farther into the crowd until he was gone. Sophia stood frozen, the reality of his departure sinking in with painful slowness. She looked down at the suitcase she had packed, the one she had brought with the hope of starting a new chapter with him. Now, it was just a symbol of the shattered dream she had clung to for so long. The tears that had been threatening to fall finally broke free, but she didn't wipe them away. She couldn't. She just stood there, her heart broken, her future uncertain, as the crowd rushed by her, oblivious to the storm raging inside her. She was alone now, alone in the middle of one of the busiest cities in the world, with no idea how to move forward. But there was something else, a tiny flicker of determination that began to rise within her. She had always been strong, had always believed in the possibility of new beginnings, and though her heart was shattered, she knew she couldn't give up. Not now, not for her sake, and certainly not for the child growing inside her, the child that James had abandoned before even knowing he existed. Sophia pulled herself together, wiping away her tears as best as she could. She still had a life to live, a future to fight for. She had no idea how she would do it, but she would find a way, for herself and for their child. The train she had planned to take with James left without her, but she didn't need it anymore. She would take a different path, one that was hers alone. And so, she made her decision. It was time to leave New York behind, time to find somewhere new, somewhere she could start over, somewhere where she could heal. With one last look around the train station, Sophia turned and walked away, the weight of her broken dreams heavy on her shoulders, but her resolve stronger than ever. The end of one dream was only the beginning of another. Sophia Wells stood on the edge of a new life. The long bus ride to Chicago offering nothing but the hum of the engine and the occasional jolt of the wheels over rough patches of pavement. The city she had once dreamed of leaving was now a distant memory, fading behind her with each passing mile. Ahead of her was nothing but uncertainty, an unknown horizon where the future awaited, but she had no idea what it would look like. She clutched her suitcase close to her chest, the fabric worn and faded, much like the remnants of the life she had tried to build with James. But no matter how heavy the past felt, no matter how unbearable the pain of abandonment, she knew she had to push forward. For Lucas, her son, her beautiful boy, had been the light that guided her out of the darkness. Since the moment she had found out she was pregnant, she had sworn to herself that she would never let him feel the weight of James's absence. She wouldn't let him grow up asking questions she couldn't answer, wondering why his father had walked out on him before he even had the chance to know him. The long road ahead was daunting, but Sophia had always believed in new beginnings. She had no choice but to keep going. And Chicago, with its towering skyline and promises of fresh starts, would be the place where she could build something new, something she could call her own. Upon arriving, Sophia found a small apartment in a quiet, working-class neighborhood. It wasn't glamorous or spacious, but it was hers. It was a place where she could heal, where she could raise Lucas without reminders of her past life. Every corner of the apartment, every creak of the floorboards beneath her feet, felt like a victory. She had survived. And now, it was time to rebuild. To make ends meet, Sophia took on work as a substitute teacher at the local high school. The job wasn't glamorous either, but it kept food on the table and a roof over their heads. More importantly, it allowed her to help others, something she had always loved to do. Though the hours were long and the pay was modest, she found a sense of fulfillment in shaping young minds, guiding them through their own struggles. And every evening, when she returned home to Lucas, she felt a warmth in her heart that made the exhaustion bearable. Lucas had been only a few months old when James left, and he had no memory of his father. As he grew, Sophia did her best to shield him from the hurt and the unanswered questions. She told him stories about how his father had died before he was born, a lie she carried like a weight on her chest, but one she believed necessary to protect him from the pain of abandonment. Lucas, in his innocence, never questioned her. He simply believed in the love she gave him, the love that filled their small home every day. And yet, there were times, small moments, that Sophia could see the curiosity in his eyes. He was growing into a smart, independent young man. He was starting to notice the world around him, beginning to ask questions about family, about fathers, about where he had come from. These were questions Sophia dreaded, and every time Lucas mentioned his father, she found herself fumbling for words, changing the subject, or offering him a vague answer. She could never bring herself to tell him the truth. But life had a way of moving forward, even when we weren't ready for it. And for all her determination to shield Lucas from the pain of his past, she knew that one day, he would find out the truth. Meanwhile, James's life had continued without her, without Lucas. His career had taken off, the very one he had sacrificed their family for. As he climbed the corporate ladder, he surrounded himself with people who admired his ambition, his drive. But inside, there was a hollow space. He had achieved everything he had ever wanted professionally, but there was a lingering emptiness he couldn't ignore. The life he could have had with Sophia and Lucas haunted him, especially in quiet moments when he allowed himself to think about the past. James had always been driven by a need to prove himself, to meet his family's expectations, to live up to the legacy his father had set before him. And yet, as the years passed, he couldn't escape the nagging feeling that someone, was missing. The woman he had loved, the son he had never known. But the walls he had built around himself were high and thick, and even as he thought about them, he pushed the thoughts aside. He couldn't afford to be weak. He had made his choice, and now he had to live with it. 5 years passed, and life continued to unfold in unexpected ways. Sophia and Lucas had settled into their routine in Chicago, their bond stronger than ever. Lucas was thriving, excelling in school, becoming a young man who was everything Sophia had hoped for. He was kind, driven, and full of promise. He had never questioned his father's absence until one fateful day. It was a crisp autumn afternoon when everything changed. Sophia and Lucas had decided to take a trip to New York City. It had been a long time since they had been to the East Coast, and Sophia had promised Lucas a trip to the city that never slept. It was supposed to be a simple getaway, a chance to see Broadway, visit Central Park, and enjoy a few days away from the grind of everyday life. Little did they know that this trip would turn their world upside down. At the airport, amidst the hustle and bustle of travelers, Sophia's heart skipped a beat. There, standing in front of her, was a man who looked uncannily familiar. It took her a moment to place him, but when she did, her breath caught in her throat. James. But what made the moment even more surreal was that Lucas, standing beside her, was staring at the man in shock, his eyes wide with recognition. The resemblance between the two men was uncanny. Lucas, her son, her precious boy, looked exactly like him. For the first time in years, Sophia felt the weight of the secret she had kept so carefully hidden. The truth was about to come crashing down, and there was no turning back. The shock of seeing James again, after all these years, was overwhelming for Sophia. She stood frozen at the airport terminal, watching him in disbelief. Her heart thudded painfully in her chest, and her breath quickened as she tried to process the impossibility of the situation. James Walker, the man who had once been her whole world, was standing just a few feet away. But there was something else, a deeper, more haunting realization. It wasn't just James. It was the way Lucas was looking at him, his eyes wide, almost searching, as if trying to make sense of the sudden appearance of this stranger who bore an uncanny resemblance to him. Lucas had never known his father. To him, James was nothing more than a name, a distant shadow in the story Sophia had woven around him, a story that was now unraveling before her eyes. He had always accepted the version of the truth that Sophia had given him, that his father had died before he was born. Now, that lie was falling apart, and the truth was standing right in front of them. Sophia's mind raced. She had never been prepared for this moment. She had always known deep down that Lucas would one day ask about his father, but she had never imagined it would happen like this, in such a public, unexpected way. Her heart ached as she looked at Lucas, his face a mix of confusion and curiosity, his innocent eyes searching for answers. James, on the other hand, seemed to be just as taken aback. His gaze shifted from Sophia to Lucas, and then back again, a flicker of recognition crossing his face. His lips parted, but for a moment, no words came. It was as if he was trying to comprehend the weight of the situation, of the child standing before him, the child he never knew existed. Finally, it was Lucas who broke the silence. His voice was soft, almost hesitant, as he turned to Sophia, seeking clarity. "Mom, who is this man?" Sophia's heart clenched at the sound of his words. How could she explain this? How could she tell him the truth when she had spent so many years protecting him from it? Her eyes welled with tears as she met Lucas's gaze, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. Taking a deep breath, she turned to James, her voice trembling but firm. "Lucas, this is James, your father." The words felt heavy in the air, hanging between them like a delicate thread that could snap at any moment. Lucas blinked, his expression one of disbelief. He looked from Sophia to James, his brow furrowing as he processed what she had just said. My father?" His voice cracked slightly, as if the concept was too surreal to fully grasp. Sophia nodded, her heart aching for the son she had tried so hard to shield from the truth. She could see the confusion in his eyes, the turmoil, as he processed the revelation. This was a moment that would change everything. There was no going back now. James, finally finding his voice, stepped forward. I never knew," he said, his tone heavy with regret. "I never knew about you, Lucas." His eyes shifted to Sophia, and for a brief moment, the hardness in them softened. "Sophia, I didn't mean for this to happen. I never intended to hurt you, or him." Sophia shook her head, her emotions a swirling storm inside her. She had never expected him to say anything different. He always had a way with words, a way to make everything sound like it wasn't his fault. But the truth was, he had walked away. He had chosen his career, his family's expectations, over the life they could have had, over their son. "I don't want to hear your excuses, James," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. "You left. You abandoned us. You didn't want a family. You didn't want a child." James flinched at her words, but there was no denying their truth. The years of silence between them had been filled with the weight of all that had been left unsaid. And now, here they were, facing the consequences of choices that had been made long ago. Lucas remained silent, his eyes now fixed on James, trying to make sense of the man who stood before him. There was a growing sense of disbelief in his expression. He had always known something was missing, but now that he was confronted with the man who had caused the void, he didn't know how to feel. Anger, confusion, sadness, they all swirled within him, but he couldn't quite make sense of it. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of silence, Lucas spoke again, his voice quiet but resolute. "Why didn't you tell me? Why did you let me believe you were gone?" Sophia's heart broke at the pain in her son's voice. She had protected him from the truth for so long, but now, the dam had broken. The truth had come flooding in, and there was no way to hide it anymore. "I did it to protect you," she said softly, her voice filled with regret. "I didn't want you to hurt. I didn't want you to feel abandoned. I wanted you to grow up without that pain." Lucas's gaze softened as he looked at her, the anger slowly fading. "But you were lying to me all these years. You didn't trust me enough to know the truth." Sophia nodded, guilt flooding through her. "I didn't know how to tell you. I didn't want to shatter the world you knew." James, standing awkwardly between them, finally spoke again, his voice filled with emotion. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness. I know I can't take back what I did, but I want to be here for you, Lucas. I want to make things right if I can." Lucas looked at James for a long moment, studying him, trying to see if there was any truth in his words. The young man who had grown up without a father, who had built his life with his mother's love and strength, didn't know if he could let this man into his life. This man who had abandoned them both. The betrayal was deep, and the hurt was real. But somewhere beneath the anger, beneath the confusion, Lucas saw a glimmer of something else. An understanding that this man, however flawed, was a part of him. He could never replace the father figure he had missed, but maybe, just maybe, there was room for him to be something in his life again. "I don't know what to say," Lucas said, his voice quieter now. "I don't know if I can just forgive you. It's too much, but I'm not going to shut you out. I need time." James nodded, his face filled with gratitude and remorse. "Take all the time you need. I'll be here. I won't leave again." Sophia watched the exchange, her heart torn. She had never wanted this moment to come, never wanted her son to have to face the man who had abandoned him. But now that it was here, she knew they would have to navigate it together. They would have to rebuild, not just their relationship with James, but with each other. And though it would be difficult, though the road ahead would be long and filled with challenges, Sophia knew they would face it together. It was time to move forward, to embrace the truth, no matter how painful it was, and to find a way to heal. The days following that fateful encounter at the airport felt like a whirlwind. It was as though the ground beneath Sophia and Lucas's feet had shifted, throwing them off balance and into uncharted territory. The truth, which Sophia had so carefully shielded her son from for years, had erupted like a thunderstorm, leaving them both drenched in its aftermath. The presence of James in their lives, Lucas's biological father, was like a shadow that neither of them could escape. But as the weeks passed, Lucas began to adjust to the reality of having his father back in his life, or at least, back in the periphery. The shock had faded, replaced by a complex mix of emotions that he couldn't quite decipher. Anger still simmered beneath the surface, but curiosity, confusion, and even a reluctant sense of connection began to emerge. For Sophia, each day was a struggle to reconcile the truth with the love she had poured into raising Lucas on her own. She had worked so hard to create a life for him that was full of love and stability, and now it felt as though that foundation was cracking. The man who had once abandoned them both was suddenly back, trying to worm his way into their lives. She had never expected to have to share her son with James, and yet here they were. Lucas was trying to find his place in this new reality. It wasn't easy for him to reconcile the image of the father he had longed for with the man who had left him behind. He had spent so many years living without a father, forming his identity without the guidance of the man who should have been there. Now, seeing James, who was nothing like the idealized figure in his mind, was disorienting. At school, Lucas excelled. He was smart, driven, and focused, earning praise from his teachers and respect from his peers. He had always been independent, preferring to solve problems on his own rather than relying on others. This characteristic, so ingrained in him from a young age, served him well in his studies, but it also created a barrier between him and the people around him. He threw himself into his academic work, losing himself in textbooks and research projects, avoiding the emotional turbulence that had stirred up in his life. He found solace in logic and structure, in the things he could control, while avoiding the one thing that threatened to shake his entire world, the return of James. Sophia, too, threw herself into her work. She had always been the glue that held their small family together, and now, as the weight of her past collided with her present, she focused on her role as Lucas's mother and protector. But the questions that Lucas now had about his father weren't easily answered. She couldn't provide him with the answers he needed, not without facing the painful truths she had buried for so long. One afternoon, as the fall air grew crisp and the leaves turned shades of gold and orange, Lucas came home from school earlier than usual. His expression was different, more thoughtful than usual, and Sophia could see that something was on his mind. "Mom," Lucas said as he sat across from her at the kitchen table, his voice hesitant, "can we talk?" Sophia put down the cup of coffee she had been sipping and gave him her full attention. She had learned long ago to recognize when Lucas needed to talk. It wasn't always easy for him to open up, especially now, when the world seemed to be in such turmoil. "Of course," she replied softly, her heart racing a little. She could already feel the weight of the conversation to come, the undercurrent of uncertainty between them both. Lucas took a deep breath, his gaze flickering briefly to the window, where the sunlight filtered through the trees outside, casting soft shadows across the floor. He had always been more of a thinker, and Sophia could tell that he was carefully choosing his words. "I've been thinking about Dad," he began, and for the first time, there was no hint of anger in his voice. "I've been trying to figure out what it all means. I mean, how do you just walk away from your family, from your kid, and then come back like nothing happened?" Sophia felt a pang of guilt in her chest. She knew exactly what he was feeling. The anger, the confusion, the sense of betrayal. She had carried those same emotions for years. But now, it was Lucas's turn to process everything. "I don't have the answers, Lucas," she said softly, her voice tinged with sadness. "I wish I could explain why your father left, but there's no simple answer. He made choices that hurt us both, and I tried to protect you from that pain. I thought that by keeping the truth from you, I could keep you safe." Lucas nodded, his expression distant. "I get it. I understand why you did it. But I'm not a kid anymore, Mom. I'm not sure if I can just pretend everything is okay. I can't just forget that he left us." "I know, sweetheart," she said, reaching across the table to take his hand. "I know you're angry, and you have every right to be. But I want you to understand something. I'm not asking you to forgive him, not if you're not ready. But you don't have to carry this burden alone. I'm here for you. I always will be." Lucas met her eyes, and for a moment, she saw a flicker of the little boy who had once looked at her with complete trust. The boy who had believed in her, who had never questioned her love. That boy was still there, beneath the surface, trying to make sense of a world that had suddenly turned upside down. "I don't know if I can forgive him, Mom," Lucas admitted quietly, "but I don't want to keep carrying this anger either. It feels heavy, like it's weighing me down." Sophia squeezed his hand gently. "You don't have to forgive him right now. Take your time, but don't let this consume you. It's not worth it." Over the next few months, Lucas began to slowly open up to James. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't without resistance, but he allowed his father to be a part of his life in small ways. At first, their interactions were awkward. James didn't know how to bridge the gap, and Lucas wasn't sure he even wanted to try. But as time went on, something shifted. James started to show up for Lucas in ways that, though small, were meaningful. He attended school events, offered advice on his projects, and even helped with some of the financial burdens that came with college preparations. But it wasn't just James who was changing. Lucas was, too. He was learning to let go of some of the resentment he had carried for so long. He didn't have to accept James's past mistakes, but he was beginning to see that there was room for something different, something that could still be good. Sophia watched as her son navigated this new territory, and her heart swelled with pride. Lucas was stronger than she had ever realized. Despite everything that had happened, he was finding his way through the pain, through the confusion, and was beginning to carve out his own path, one that wasn't defined by the choices of the past. And, for the first time in years, Sophia allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was hope for their fractured family after all. It would take time. It would take healing. But it wasn't impossible. And that was a future worth fighting for. The crisp winter air swept through the streets of New York City as Lucas and Sophia stood side by side at the busy airport terminal. Their trip had been planned for months. Lucas had been accepted into a prestigious internship, and Sophia had decided to accompany him, offering support as her son stepped into a new chapter of his life. The last few months had been filled with change, with Lucas slowly beginning to adjust to his new reality, the presence of James in his life, their cautious steps towards a fragile relationship. Despite the tension and the unresolved questions that hung between them, life had somehow continued. It had become a series of small steps forward, as both mother and son learned how to navigate this strange new world they found themselves in. Lucas had grown quieter over the past few weeks, his mind consumed with the weight of everything that had unfolded. Every time he thought about James, he felt a mixture of emotions that were too overwhelming to untangle: anger, curiosity, and even an unexpected pang of longing. He wasn't sure what he wanted from James anymore, but he knew that the man who had abandoned them both had somehow become a part of his life again, no matter how hard he tried to deny it. Sophia, too, had her own battle to fight. It wasn't just Lucas who was struggling to make sense of the past. She was too. She had spent so many years protecting Lucas from the pain of abandonment, weaving a story where James had never existed in their lives. Now, with the truth exposed, she had to come to terms with her own feelings of betrayal. She had to figure out how to move forward, not just for herself, but for Lucas, who was learning to process a history that had been hidden from him for so long. As they waited for their flight, the terminal filled with the hustle and bustle of travelers coming and going. The sounds of announcements, footsteps, and chatter filled the air. It was the perfect picture of everyday life, except, for Sophia and Lucas, everything felt different now. The past had caught up with them, and it loomed over them, both visible and intangible. Then, out of nowhere, it happened. Sophia froze, her heart skipping a beat as she scanned the crowd. It was a fleeting moment, a brief glimpse of someone in the distance. She blinked, sure she was imagining things. But when her eyes locked onto the man standing a few feet away, the world seemed to slow down. Her breath caught in her throat as a familiar figure came into focus. There, standing near the security checkpoint, was James. It was him, the man who had broken her heart, the man who had left them all those years ago, never looking back, the man who had disappeared from her life like a ghost, only to resurface now, when everything had changed. For a moment, Sophia couldn't breathe. Her mind raced, her heart pounding in her chest. She hadn't seen him in years, and she hadn't expected to ever see him again. Not like this, in the middle of a crowded airport. The shock of it hit her like a tidal wave, drowning her in emotions she had buried for so long. "Mom." Lucas's voice cut through her thoughts, and she turned to see him staring at her, his expression unreadable. He must have noticed her sudden stillness, the way her hand instinctively tightened around her purse. Sophia's voice came out as a whisper, hoarse with emotion. "It's him, Lucas. Your father. He's here." Lucas's gaze followed hers, and his face went pale as he saw the man standing across the terminal. For a long moment, neither of them moved, both caught in the intensity of the moment. It was as though time had stopped, and everything else faded into the background. James, meanwhile, hadn't noticed them at first. He was speaking with someone, a woman beside him, his back turned. But then, as if drawn by an invisible force, he turned around. His eyes locked onto Sophia's, and for a moment, it felt as though the world had closed in around them. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his gaze, a flicker of recognition, regret, and perhaps 1,000 unspoken words. Sophia's heart tightened, and she felt a wave of emotion wash over her. The man who had once been her world, the man she had loved with everything she had, was standing there, mere feet away. The years of pain, of silence, of unanswered questions, they all seemed to come rushing back in an instant. Lucas, sensing the shift in the air, looked back at Sophia, his jaw clenched. "You're really going to talk to him?" His voice was strained, a mixture of disbelief and something deeper that he couldn't quite put into words. Sophia hesitated, unsure of what to do. Her instinct screamed at her to turn away, to pretend she hadn't seen him, to protect herself and Lucas from the pain of facing the man who had broken their lives apart. But as she stood there, she couldn't deny the pull of something else, a need for closure, perhaps, or a chance to finally confront the ghosts of their past. Before she could respond, James took a step forward, his gaze never leaving hers. He had seen the look on Sophia's face, and though it had been years since he had last seen her, the pain in her eyes was unmistakable. "Sophia," he said, his voice rough with emotion. I never thought I'd see you again. I'm sorry. I never wanted to hurt you." Sophia's breath hitched in her throat, and for a moment, she couldn't speak. His apology felt hollow, meaningless. What did it matter now? What good were words after everything that had happened? She had spent so many years building a life without him, raising Lucas alone, never once asking for his return. And now, here he was, with nothing but empty apologies and the same old regrets. Lucas, who had been silent until now, stepped forward, his voice hard. "You have a lot of nerve, don't you? Showing up like this, acting like you can just walk back into our lives after all these years. You think saying sorry is enough?" James flinched at the rawness in Lucas's words. He opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. The pain in his son's voice, the bitterness, it was more than he had expected. But then again, what had he expected? After abandoning them both, there was no way to make up for the years lost. "I know I can't fix what I did," James said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I'm here now. I want to be part of your life, Lucas. If you'll let me." Lucas's eyes narrowed, his jaw set. "You think you can just pick up where you left off? You can't erase the past. You can't erase what you did to us." Sophia, her heart heavy with years of unresolved pain, finally found her voice. "Lucas," she said, her voice soft but firm, "this is something you have to decide for yourself. I can't make that choice for you. But you don't have to forgive him right now, and you don't have to do anything you're not ready for." Lucas looked at her, his expression torn. His emotions were a storm inside him, but one thing was clear. He wasn't ready to let James back into his life. Not yet. As the three of them stood in the crowded airport, the weight of their past hanging between them, Sophia realized that this encounter, though painful, was just the beginning. It wasn't the end of their story, but it was the moment they would all have to face their truths and decide what came next. The silence that followed James's words felt suffocating. It was as though the entire airport had disappeared, leaving only the three of them in a fragile bubble of unresolved emotions. Sophia felt a sharp pang in her chest as she watched Lucas struggle with the weight of the moment, his fists clenched at his sides. She had spent so many years protecting him from the truth, crafting a narrative where James had never existed in their lives. Now, that carefully built world was shattering around them, and there was no escaping the reality that Lucas would have to confront the man who had abandoned them. Sophia glanced at Lucas, her heart aching for him. This wasn't just about her. This was about her son, the young man who had grown up without a father and had always believed that his father had died before he was born. How could she possibly explain to him that the truth was far more painful than she had ever imagined? Lucas's voice broke the stillness. "So you're here now," he said, his tone icy. "You've got your apology, and you think that's enough?" James opened his mouth to speak, but the words stuck in his throat. He had spent years wondering if he would ever be able to make amends, But now that he was standing here, face to face with his son, he realized how much he had underestimated the depth of the pain he had caused. The words didn't come easily. How could they, when the years of silence and absence couldn't be erased with a few heartfelt apologies? I don't expect you to forgive me, Lucas, James said, his voice tinged with regret. I know I can't just erase what I've done, and I don't expect you to let me back into your life just because I'm here now. I know I don't have that right. Lucas's eyes flashed with anger. You're damn right you don't, he snapped. You left us, and now you think you can just show up and make everything okay? You think you can just waltz back into our lives after abandoning us for years? Sophia winced at her son's words. She knew that this moment had been inevitable, but it still hurt to hear the venom in Lucas's voice. She had spent so many years trying to shield him from this kind of pain, but now it was spilling over, and she had no idea how to stop it. She stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on Lucas's arm. Lucas, please, she said softly. I know you're angry, and you have every right to be, but this is something you need to decide for yourself. I can't make that decision for you. Lucas looked at her, his eyes full of confusion and hurt. How am I supposed to decide? He asked, his voice raw. You told me he was dead. All these years, I thought my father was dead, and now you tell me he's alive, and he's standing right here, acting like nothing ever happened. Sophia felt the sting of his words like a physical blow. She had never meant to lie to him, but she had never anticipated a moment like this either. She had done what she thought was best, protecting Lucas from the pain of knowing the truth. But now, standing here with James in front of them, it was clear that the truth was far more complicated than she could have ever imagined. I didn't want you to have to carry that burden, Sophia said, her voice barely above a whisper. I thought it would be easier if you didn't know the truth. I thought it would protect you from the hurt he caused us both. James's eyes darkened, guilt and regret flooding his expression. I never wanted to hurt either of you, he said, his voice breaking. I know I did, and I'll regret that for the rest of my life. But I'm here now, and I want to try, at least, to be a part of your life, Lucas. The words hung in the air, heavy and full of uncertainty. Lucas shook his head, unable to comprehend what was happening. I don't know if I can ever forgive you, he said, his voice a mixture of anger and pain. You can't just show up and think everything is going to be okay. You don't get to do that. Sophia could see the conflict in Lucas's eyes, the struggle between the anger he felt and the longing for answers, for a father who had been absent for so long. It was clear that Lucas wasn't ready to forgive James, but she also saw something else in him, a flicker of curiosity, a spark of the desire to understand the man who had once been his father. I'm not asking for your forgiveness, James said, his voice soft. I'm asking for a chance to prove that I can be the father you never had, a chance to make things right. Lucas was silent for a moment, his gaze fixed on James. The tension between them was thick, and Sophia could see the wheels turning in her son's mind. She had always known that Lucas was strong, stronger than she had ever been, but this was a different kind of strength. This was the strength it took to face the past, to look into the eyes of the man who had hurt them both, and decide whether or not to allow him back into their lives. I don't know if I can do that, Lucas said finally, his voice strained. I don't know if I can just forget everything you did and let you back in. James nodded slowly, as if he had expected that response. I don't want you to forget, he said quietly. I just want you to know that I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere. Sophia watched the exchange between father and son, her heart torn. She had always believed that Lucas deserved better, that he deserved a father who would love him and be there for him. But now, as she saw the raw emotion between them, she realized that nothing would ever be the same. The past was never something they could simply erase, no matter how much they wanted to. I need some time, Lucas said, his voice quieter now, but no less determined. I need time to think about all this. I don't know what I want right now. Sophia nodded, understanding the weight of his words. I know, she said softly, and you don't have to decide anything right now. Take your time. We all need time. The three of them stood there in the airport, the weight of the moment pressing down on them. There was no resolution, no easy answers. just the quiet understanding that their lives had been irrevocably changed. The road ahead would be difficult, there was no doubt about that, but it was also full of possibility. And as they turned to leave, the truth still hung heavy between them, a truth that would take time to fully process, to accept. But it was a truth they could no longer run from. The journey had only just begun. The days following their fateful encounter in the airport felt like a blur. Michael couldn't escape the image of Lucas's face, the angry, confused eyes that seemed to pierce through him with an intensity that made him shudder. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the raw pain that Lucas carried, a pain that Michael had caused and could never fully erase. He had come to this moment expecting some form of closure, expecting to be able to apologize and make things right, but what he hadn't prepared for was how deep the wounds ran. Lucas wasn't ready to forgive him, and Michael knew he couldn't just walk in and act as though years of abandonment could be washed away in a single conversation. He had no right to expect Lucas to trust him again after everything he had done, but he also knew he couldn't give up, not after finally seeing his son face to face. He had to try. Michael spent the next few days in a state of constant reflection, replaying his past decisions over and over in his mind. There were so many moments he wished he could go back and change. So many times he had chosen his career over the family he had started. But what haunted him the most was the knowledge that he had never been there for Lucas. His son had grown up without a father's love, without guidance, and Michael had done nothing to stop it. The guilt gnawed at him. He knew that to redeem himself, to prove that he was willing to change, he would need to start small. He couldn't expect Lucas to forgive him overnight, but he could show him, little by little, that he was serious about being a part of his life. Michael knew the best way to approach this was through action. Words could only do so much, but actions, consistent, genuine actions, might begin to break through the walls that Lucas had built around himself. One afternoon, after much deliberation, Michael reached out to Sophia. She had been understandably distant since the airport confrontation, but he had to try. He couldn't do this alone. They were all tangled up in this mess together, and he needed her help. She had carried so much on her own for so long, and if there was even the slightest chance they could work together to help Lucas, he had to take it. Sophia's response came after a long pause, as if she was still processing the whirlwind of emotions from their meeting. "I'm not sure what you expect from me, Michael," she said over the phone, her voice cautious but not unkind. "Lucas needs time. We all need time." "I understand," Michael replied, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "But I'm not going anywhere. I want to be here for him, Sophia. I know I can't undo the past, but I want to be part of his future. I know it's not going to be easy, but I'll do whatever it takes." There was a silence on the other end before Sophia spoke again, her voice soft. "I know you're trying, but you can't expect Lucas to just forget everything. He's hurt, Michael, and he's not going to let you in without proving that you're serious." "I get it. I'm not expecting forgiveness right away," Michael said, a quiet resolve in his tone. "But I need you to help me. I want to show him that I'm here for the long haul, and I'll prove it to both of you." Sophia sighed, and Michael could hear the exhaustion in her voice. "Okay, let's take it slow. No promises, but we'll see." It wasn't much, but it was a start. The next day, Michael showed up at the cafe where Lucas worked, his mind racing as he entered the bustling space. He wasn't sure what he expected to find, but the familiar sight of Lucas, still looking so much like the young man he had abandoned, yet so much more grown, tugged at his heart in ways he hadn't anticipated. The last time he had seen his son, Lucas had been a child, a face full of innocence and hope. Now, he was a young man with a sharp edge, a guardedness that was impossible to miss. Lucas glanced up from the counter when Michael walked in, his expression hardening immediately. There was no smile, no welcoming gesture, just the same cool, distant gaze that had greeted him in the airport. Michael hesitated for a moment before walking up to the counter, his heart pounding. Michael began, but the words stuck in his throat. He wasn't sure how to begin. What could he say that would make a difference? "Why are you here?" Lucas's voice was low, but there was a bite to it, a challenge in his tone. "You've got your apology. What more do you want?" Michael swallowed, fighting the tightness in his chest. "I want to make it right," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. I know I can't change the past, but I'm not going to disappear this time. I'm here, Lucas. For you. For whatever you need. Lucas's gaze flickered, uncertainty flashing in his eyes for the briefest of moments before he quickly masked it. I don't need anything from you, he said curtly. You had your chance, Michael. The words stung, but Michael didn't flinch. He wasn't going to back down. He knew that if he wanted to earn Lucas's trust, he had to show him that he wasn't going anywhere, that his presence wasn't just a fleeting attempt to make up for the years he had lost. I'm not asking for you to trust me, Michael said. I'm asking for a chance. To be there for you, in whatever way you need. No expectations. Just let me prove it. Lucas was silent for a long moment, his eyes searching Michael's face as though trying to determine if this was yet another empty promise. But Michael stood his ground, his heart heavy with the weight of his own mistakes and the desire to make things right. Finally, Lucas spoke again, his voice quieter now, though still guarded. I don't know if I can trust you, he admitted, his words laced with a quiet pain. I don't know if I ever will. I understand, Michael said softly, but I'll be here, every day. I'll show you, Lucas. I'll show you that I'm not going anywhere. Lucas met his gaze, and for the first time since they had met in the airport, there was something softer in his eyes. Not forgiveness, not yet, but something like the beginning of hope. I don't need you to fix everything, Lucas said finally. I just need you to show up. And if you can do that, we'll see. It wasn't much, but it was everything to Michael. It was a start. And for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to hope. The weeks following Michael's tentative re-entry into Lucas's life were full of quiet progress and difficult adjustments. Each moment was a delicate balance between what could be and what had been. Lucas was far from ready to fully embrace the idea of having his father back, but the small gestures from Michael, simple but sincere, began to chip away at the walls Lucas had built around himself. It was painfully slow, but Michael didn't mind. He had learned long ago that the things worth fighting for rarely came easy. It started with brief conversations, casual at first, about nothing in particular. Michael made sure to be present at the cafe where Lucas worked, showing up in the early mornings to grab a coffee, always making a point to ask about Lucas's day. The exchanges were curt, sometimes awkward, but they were real. Michael knew this was just the beginning. Lucas was testing him, just as he should be. After all, Michael had never earned the right to demand anything from him. Lucas, in turn, was unsure of how to navigate this strange new reality. His initial anger hadn't dissipated, but over time, there were moments, small, fleeting, that caused him to reconsider his stance. When Michael had come to him and offered help with his studies, he had refused at first, too proud to admit that he might need it. But one late night, struggling with a complicated project for university, he had texted Michael, unsure of where the impulse came from. Can you help with this research? I'm stuck. It was a simple request, but it was a door opening. A sign that Lucas might just be starting to trust him, or at the very least, he was beginning to see Michael as someone who could offer more than apologies. Michael had immediately agreed. He was at Lucas's side within an hour, sitting at the small desk in the back of Lucas's apartment, his son sitting across from him, looking hesitant but willing. The conversation that night was less about the research and more about the space between them, the unspoken tension that simmered under the surface. Michael focused on the task at hand, offering suggestions, but his mind kept drifting to the moments they were spending together. For the first time, he was allowed to be part of Lucas's life in a meaningful way. He didn't try to push for anything more. He simply let the quiet moments linger, watching as Lucas slowly started to engage with him, offering small but telling glimpses of the young man he had become. It's strange, you know, Lucas had said, staring at the screen in front of him. I've spent so much time trying to avoid thinking about you, about what you did. But now, it's like you're just here. I don't know how to deal with that. Michael had nodded, understanding far more than Lucas realized. I never expected you to know how to deal with me. I'm here, Lucas, and I'll be here. I can't take back the time I lost, but I'm not going anywhere now. Lucas didn't say anything in response, but there was a subtle shift in his demeanor, something softer in his eyes. It wasn't forgiveness, Not yet, but it was a crack in the armor. As the days passed, Michael became a more consistent presence in their lives. He was never overbearing, never demanding anything of Lucas, but he was always there when needed. Whether it was offering advice on how to navigate a tricky situation at university or just sitting quietly in the corner while Lucas studied, offering a quiet solidarity. Sophia, who had been cautious about allowing Michael back into their lives, began to see the subtle changes in Lucas. He wasn't as angry as before, and he wasn't as closed off. He was still distant, but there was a gentler edge to his demeanor, a willingness to engage, even if just for a few moments at a time. Michael's steady presence, his refusal to give up, had started to create cracks in the walls Lucas had so carefully built. One evening, after a particularly long day of studying, Lucas finally spoke up. He and Michael were sitting together at a small cafe, the table between them cluttered with textbooks and notebooks. Lucas was tired, physically, emotionally, mentally, and he rubbed his eyes in frustration. "I'm not sure I can keep pretending that everything's fine," Lucas admitted, looking at his father with an almost vulnerable expression. "I don't know how to move forward. You left. I don't think I'll ever understand why you did, but I'm tired of being angry all the time." Michael's heart ached as he heard the rawness in his son's voice. He had been waiting for this moment, the moment when Lucas finally let go of his bitterness, even if just a little. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a step forward. A significant one. "You don't have to forgive me right away," Michael said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I understand that it's going to take time. But I'm here, Lucas. I'm not going anywhere. And I'm going to do everything I can to make up for the years I missed." Lucas met his gaze, his eyes searching Michael's face for sincerity. "I'm not saying I'm ready to forgive you, or that everything will just go back to normal, but I'm willing to try. I don't know what that means yet, but I guess that's something." It was a fragile admission, but it was progress. For Michael, it felt like a victory, even if it was a small one. The road ahead was still long, filled with uncertainty and setbacks, but for the first time in years, there was hope. He wasn't expecting Lucas to trust him overnight, but this moment, this small, quiet moment, was proof that maybe, just maybe, they could rebuild what had been lost. In the days that followed, their relationship continued to evolve, but it wasn't without challenges. Sophia, who had watched from the sidelines, began to see the subtle changes in her son as well. He wasn't completely open to Michael yet, but the walls he had built around himself were beginning to show cracks. And for Sophia, that was a sign that things might be changing for the better. She wasn't quite ready to forgive Michael for the pain he had caused her, but she could see that he was trying. And perhaps that was all they could ask for: time, and the chance to rebuild from the ruins. One evening, as they all sat together in the living room, the air thick with unspoken words, Sophia found herself looking at Michael with a measure of something unfamiliar, something close to forgiveness, or at least the possibility of it. She had spent years resenting him, blaming him for everything that had gone wrong in their lives. But now, as she watched the way he interacted with Lucas, the way he tried so hard to make up for the lost time, she realized something. Maybe they didn't have to have all the answers. Maybe they didn't have to go back to the way things were. But perhaps, just perhaps, they could build something new from the pieces they had left. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't be perfect, but it would be theirs. And for the first time in a long time, Michael dared to hope that maybe, just maybe, it would be enough. The days turned into weeks, and the tentative steps Michael had taken toward healing the fractured relationship with Lucas slowly started to take on more weight. He found himself reflecting on his past mistakes with greater clarity, seeing in the way Lucas interacted with him, or in the silence between them, just how deep the wounds ran. The guilt gnawed at him, but it was no longer the crippling guilt of the man who had abandoned his family. It had morphed into something else, a resolve to do better, even if he could never fully undo the damage he had caused. Lucas, however, was still guarded. Though he had started to open up to his father, and their interactions had become more frequent, there was always an undercurrent of hesitation in his eyes. Michael could see it, a wariness, an unwillingness to fully commit to the idea that someone who had once walked away could now be relied on. It was a slow, exhausting process to gain his son's trust, and sometimes, Michael felt like he was walking a tightrope, not sure if the next step would send him falling back into the abyss of rejection. Sophia, too, was watching. Her own wounds were still fresh, the scars of years of betrayal and anger never far from the surface. Though she tried to remain neutral, she found herself slipping back into old patterns of mistrust when Michael was around. Her own bitterness toward him made it difficult for her to fully allow him back into their lives, even if Lucas was more open than ever before. Despite these challenges, there were moments when the flicker of something real, something that could grow into a renewed connection, surfaced. One late evening, as Michael sat across from Lucas in their small living room, both of them exhausted from a long day of work and study, Michael asked a question he had been meaning to ask for a long time. "Lucas," Michael began, his voice softer than usual, "I know I don't have the right to ask this, but do you think I can ever really make things right?" Lucas paused, his gaze drifting to the floor before meeting his father's eyes. It was the first time he had truly considered that question in full. "I don't know," Lucas replied, his voice distant yet thoughtful. "I mean, how could you? You left, and not just once, but you made it clear that your career, your family, everything else came before us. I don't know if I'll ever be able to forget that. It's not easy." Michael nodded, a lump rising in his throat. He had no defense, no excuse that would make the years of absence disappear. He understood the gravity of his actions. "But you're here now," Lucas continued, his voice quieter. "And I'm not saying that changes everything, but I guess I'm trying to understand if this is real. If you're really here because you want to be part of my life, or if this is just some kind of guilt trip for you." Michael leaned forward, the words heavy in his chest. "I'm here because I want to be a part of your life, Lucas. And not because I feel guilty. Well, I do feel guilty, but that's not the only reason. I want to be here for you, because I know I've missed so much. I can't undo the past, but I can be here now. And that's what I'm trying to do. One step at a time." There was a long silence. Lucas seemed to wrestle with the words, trying to make sense of what he was hearing. And in that moment, Michael realized that this was the real test. Not just of whether Lucas could forgive him, but whether their relationship could survive the weight of everything that had come before it. It was the test of time, of patience, of proving that love could outlast even the deepest of wounds. In the days that followed, their relationship began to evolve in ways that neither of them expected. Lucas, though still distant at times, started to acknowledge the small efforts Michael was making to be part of his life. He didn't expect him to be perfect, but he began to see a change, a genuine attempt at redemption. And it wasn't just about making up for the years Michael had missed. It was about proving that he could be there for Lucas in the ways that mattered most. Through the quiet moments, the small gestures, and the hard conversations. Sophia, on the other hand, struggled with her own feelings of betrayal. She watched her son, proud of the progress he was making, but she couldn't shake the feeling of being left behind in the process. She had carried the burden of raising Lucas alone, and while she had done so with strength and resilience, there was always a part of her that resented Michael for not being there when she needed him the most. One evening, as she stood in the kitchen preparing dinner, she overheard a conversation between Lucas and Michael. They were sitting at the dining table, talking about his upcoming final exams, and the tension in her chest only grew as she listened to their easy camaraderie. It wasn't something she could have imagined years ago, when Michael's absence had been a constant, painful reminder of everything that had gone wrong. But now, as she heard them laughing together, she felt a pang of something she couldn't quite define. She walked into the living room, attempting to mask the unease she felt, and sat down across from them. "I'm glad you two are getting along," she said, her voice measured, even though her heart felt tight. "But just remember, this doesn't erase what happened. Don't think for a second that everything is magically okay now." Lucas looked up at her, his expression softening. "I know, Mom. I'm not pretending like everything is fixed, but I think I'm starting to understand why he's here. It's not about the past anymore. It's about what happens now." Sophia nodded slowly, her eyes flicking to Michael for a moment before returning to Lucas. "I just don't want you to get hurt again. You've been through enough already." "I know," Lucas said, his tone reassuring. "I'm careful, I promise. But I think we're all trying to move forward." And that has to mean something. It was a fragile piece, but it was a start. Sophia wasn't ready to let go of the past entirely, but she could see that Lucas was beginning to carve out his own path. It wasn't just about Michael anymore. It was about Lucas finding his own way in this new chapter, one where he could decide what his relationship with his father would look like, and whether he would allow the wounds of the past to define his future. And though it wasn't easy for any of them, it was clear that they were all willing to try and heal, to try and rebuild. Time would tell if their efforts would be enough, but for the first time, there was hope, a tentative, fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, they could rewrite the story they had been living all these years. As the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, Michael and Lucas continued to navigate this delicate new dynamic. There were still moments of uncertainty, moments when the past threatened to break through the fragile peace they had built. But through it all, there was progress, slow, but steady. They both knew that the test of time wasn't over. The real challenge would be whether they could sustain the work they had begun, and whether the bond they were building would be strong enough to survive the inevitable challenges that lay ahead. For now, however, Michael allowed himself to hold on to something he hadn't felt in years, hope. And that, for him, was enough. The morning sun filtered softly through the blinds, casting a warm glow across the small but comfortable living room. The air was crisp with the scent of freshly brewed coffee as Lucas sat on the couch, staring at the quiet street outside. It had been a year since that fateful day when Michael had first reached out to him, and in that time, much had changed. The painful echoes of the past still lingered, but they no longer held him captive. Lucas had made peace with the idea that his relationship with his father would never be perfect. The wounds of the past, the years of abandonment and betrayal, would never fully heal. But as he sat there, the weight of those memories no longer crushed him. Instead, they had transformed into a kind of understanding, a recognition of the complexity of human relationships and the sometimes painful process of growth. In the months since their reunion, Michael had proven himself in ways that Lucas hadn't expected, not through grand gestures or empty promises, but through quiet consistency. Michael had shown up, really shown up, when it mattered. He had been there for Lucas's graduation, not as the absentee father who had once been too busy with his own life, but as a man who understood the importance of family, of presence. He had been there when Lucas needed guidance, offering his advice without trying to control, without pushing for redemption. But it hadn't been easy. The road to reconciliation had been long and filled with moments of doubt. Lucas had questioned his father's motives, wondering if Michael's sudden desire to be involved was born out of guilt, or if it was something deeper. Sophia, too, had struggled with her own resentment. She was a protective mother, still wary of letting Michael back into their lives completely. But as time wore on, even she began to soften. Slowly, she realized that Lucas had to carve out his own future, and that future, whether she liked it or not, might include Michael. Now, as Lucas prepared to leave for a job interview in another city, his heart felt light for the first time in years. This was it, the beginning of something new. His future was his own, untethered by the past, shaped by the choices he was making today. The bitterness he had once carried with him like a shield had been replaced by a quiet determination, an inner strength that came from knowing who he was, and more importantly, who he wanted to become. Lucas stood up and grabbed his jacket from the back of the chair, taking one last look around the room. It was no longer a place filled with the ghosts of past heartbreaks. It had become a space for growth, for hope, and for new beginnings. As he opened the door, he was greeted by the sight of Michael, standing on the porch with a look of cautious optimism on his face. He had come to see Lucas off, a gesture that, in itself, spoke volumes. Their relationship was no longer defined by the past. It was a work in progress, something that needed time, patience, and understanding. But in this moment, Lucas knew that they were both willing to try. "Hey, you ready?" Michael asked, a slight smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Yeah," Lucas replied, his voice steady. He felt a flicker of something, maybe hope, maybe relief, as he looked at his father. It was a fleeting moment, but it was enough. Michael stepped forward and clapped him on the shoulder. "I'm proud of you, son." "No, Matt." Lucas nodded, his throat tight with emotion. The words were simple, but they meant more than Michael could ever know. In that one gesture, that one acknowledgement, Lucas felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years: acceptance. He wasn't sure if he would ever fully understand why Michael had made the choices he did, but he had come to terms with it. What mattered now was the future they were building, the future that Lucas was finally ready to embrace on his own terms. As he turned to leave, he paused for a moment, looking back at his father one last time. Michael stood there, watching him, a man humbled by time and regret, but also filled with a quiet pride. They didn't need to say anything more. The silence between them, comfortable and full of unspoken understanding, was enough. Lucas stepped into the car and started the engine. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, he was no longer afraid of it. He was ready to face whatever came next, knowing that the lessons of the past had shaped him into the man he had become. And no matter where life took him, he would never forget the love and the sacrifices that had brought him to this point. As he drove off into the morning sun, he couldn't help but feel that this was the moment when everything had changed. The past no longer held him hostage. It was time to live for the future, and for the first time in a long time, Lucas felt a deep sense of peace. Michael stood at the edge of the porch, watching the car disappear into the distance. A sense of relief washed over him, but also a bittersweet sadness. He knew that the journey with Lucas was far from over. There would be more struggles, more misunderstandings, but he also knew that they were in this together. And for the first time, Michael felt like he was truly part of his son's life, not as a distant figure from the past, but as someone who was finally showing up when it counted. He turned back into the house, the door closing softly behind him. The echoes of the past were still there, but they no longer defined him. His mistakes had been his own, and he had to live with them. But what mattered now was the future that Lucas was building, and the future that Michael would work every day to be a part of, no matter how long it took. The days passed, and though the road to healing remained difficult, there was an undeniable sense of forward motion. Lucas, in his new job and new city, was carving out a life for himself, full of challenges but also full of promise. Michael, though far away, found himself thinking about his son often. He had never expected this kind of redemption, but it had come in the most unexpected of ways, not through grand gestures, but through quiet, steady change. The past, though it could never be erased, had finally given way to a new chapter, one where both Michael and Lucas could finally breathe easy. The journey wasn't over, but for the first time, both of them were confident in one thing: the future was theirs to shape. And for that, Michael was grateful. Lucas and Michael's story is a long journey filled with pain and hope, where every step carried wounds that were not easily healed. Yet it was within those wounds that they found forgiveness and understanding, values they had searched for throughout a long, difficult path. For Lucas, this journey wasn't just about reconciling with the past. It was also about discovering himself. He learned to see himself not through the mistakes of others, but through the choices he made for himself. He understood that he had the power to shape his own future, one not dictated by the hurts of the past, but driven by hope and determination. For Michael, the years of separation and regret taught him that being a father wasn't just about being present, but about perseverance, patience, and the ability to change. Although he could never fully erase the scars he had caused, he understood that redemption wasn't always about grand gestures. It was about the small, meaningful acts of care. His daily efforts weren't just to prove that he had changed, but to be part of Lucas's life again, to rebuild the relationship they had lost. Though both men still faced many challenges ahead, they had found solace in accepting each other, in allowing themselves to love and be loved. In the end, they realized that forgiveness, even if delayed, was the greatest gift they could offer each other. Their story is a testament that while life may never be perfect, we can still change, learn, and grow through our mistakes. It is the strength of love and patience, and the reason to keep moving forward, no matter what lies ahead. And along the way, we can still find peace and hope. As Lucas drove into the promising morning, he knew he wasn't alone. Alongside Michael, no matter the distance, they would always walk together, on a path they were both creating toward a better future. The story ends here, but the journey goes on. Every day is another chance to begin again, to love, and to forgive. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this story and watch the video. Your support means the world to me, and I hope you enjoyed the journey we shared together. If you love the story, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and share with others who might enjoy it too. Your feedback and engagement help me create more stories and content that I hope will continue to inspire and entertain. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell so you won't miss out on any future updates. Once again, thank you for being a part of this adventure. Your support makes it all possible, and I'm excited to have you with me on the next chapter. See you soon.